So hi, my name is Cynthia. I thank you to Mike for inviting me to be here and present, to just tell you a little bit about myself. By kind of schooling degree, most recently I'm actually a librarian, so I worked in libraries and library-related nonprofits for many years, mostly doing web services. Both in Ontario and in BC. It was actually in Ontario while I was working at a university there that I really got into accessibility because I'll talk a little bit about it, but it got legislated in Ontario. So one of the things I had to do when upgrading our website was to make sure that it was web accessible. So I spent almost an extra month with our website just to make sure that everything was accessible and everything was ready to go. I ended up meeting with David Bolter, who is the head of accessibility at Mozilla. He was kind enough to give me some time to even just get me started in the right direction. So it was like, oh my God, I can't believe you're taking time out of your super busy work life to do this for me. But yeah, he was kind enough to do that. So ever since then, somehow I've just fallen into this role of people asking me about accessibility, especially after I moved back from BC. There's just really not a lot of people who know a lot about web accessibility in BC because it's not legislated. People don't take the time necessarily to really get into it. But I'm here to present to you today just to kind of give you a brief idea of what it's all about, what you actually really need to care about, and honestly, to make it kind of easy and hopefully not time consuming for you to at least get there, say 80% of the way. Most people are not, even in Ontario, it was very difficult to get there 100%, but you can get there probably 80% of the way with just some really easy guidelines and just knowing where to start. So what is web accessibility, right? That's what we're here to talk about it, but most people are like, oh, what are we talking about? So probably the most common definition is simply that web accessibility means that people with disabilities can use the web. And that is probably how most people understand web accessibility. And of course, the next step would actually be to define, well, what is a disability? But that's probably really hard to do. But what we can do is look at some of the different types of disabilities to get a better idea. So, any guesses? Types of disability?
Blindness.
Okay, yeah.
Auditory.
Auditory, yes.
Tactile.
Tactile, yeah, that's a good one. That's one that most people don't think of. Any others?
Intellectual disabilities.
Yeah, definitely some cognitive related ones. I think we mostly covered them. So Mike mentioned blindness, which is a visual type of blindness. But one of the things people don't think about is that it's not just blindness or even levels of, visual acuity. But it also can refer to people who have difficulty judging things like distances and also hand-eye coordination, which kind of overlaps with kind of the cognitive, but it is very much a visual thing where you have hand-eye coordination, and that can be very much affected on the visual side. So auditory, we also mentioned, but again, other than just kind of deafness, it might also refer to other types of hearing issues, such as having difficulty focusing on a single voice, especially if there's a lot of background noise. So you want to think about what does it mean for someone to have an auditory or visual disability? It's not just the kind of more common ones that we encounter, but there are other types that fall under physical or motor. Again, aside from just thinking about someone in a wheelchair, it has a lot to do with actually just even things like precise movement. So you can imagine using a mouse takes a lot of precise movement. So if you had a kind of physical disability where that, you can move the mouse, but not precisely, that can still be considered a physical disability. Touch was also mentioned. And of course, this does mostly talk about a lack of sensation and touch. And traditionally, a lot of people didn't think about this, but with touch screens being so common these days, you can imagine that that can actually have a big effect on how you use mobile devices. And then finally, cognitive. Also, it's typically classified as learning, and learning, but is also a super big umbrella. Sometimes it is referred to as cognitive. But it does include things like dyslexia and other reading abilities, as well as dysphasia and other writing related abilities. So with all the different types of devices used to access websites these days, any one or even a combination of these disabilities might apply to a user trying to access a website. Okay, so why should we care? Now that we have an idea of the group of people we're talking about, a lot of people say, oh, people with a disability are a minority and not all of them need special consideration for web accessibility. And while that may be true, you might actually be surprised by some of the facts. So according to the last Canadian survey on disability, 1 in 7, or about 14% of Canadians 15 years or older reported a disability. I didn't look at the very specific types, but, oh, sorry, I just realized this is the wrong image. Okay, well, anyways, I'll fix that, but I think that sort of is about right, too. But to help put this into perspective, the number of people with a disability is larger than any single group of visible minority in Canada. So even if we think of them as a minority, that's a really large minority. And just to touch on policy and legislation, I did mention this earlier, but in Canada, there is actually no federal legislation right now. However, Bill C-81, also known as the Accessible Canada Act, just went through its first reading back in June. While that's no guarantee of passing, obviously, it is one of the election campaign promises by the current federal government. So we might not see the exact version that is there right now, but we might see a revision of this pass, relatively soon, considering how slow legislation can be sometimes, but it might even be before the end of the year. So actual legislation in Canada, I mentioned Ontario, which has the AODA, which is the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which came into effect in 2005. They require the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, also known as WCAG 2.0, Level AA, with a couple exceptions, by 2021. Level A is already in effect, but Level AA, which is a bit more rigorous, is coming to effect by 2021 for all public institutions and as well large private and nonprofit organizations. By large, they mean 50 or more employees. So it's actually not that many employees for you to be considered large in Ontario. The other thing that we do have is the Canadian Human Rights Act of 1977, which ensures equal opportunity, but it only applies to organizations with federally regulated activities. So all other organizations fall under provincial or territorial law, though due to a court case, the standard on related to the Canadian Human Rights Act, the standard on web accessibility came into effect for all departments and agencies at the federal level, and particularly in the Government of Canada in 2011. They also outlined the requirement, which is actually the same as what AODA came out with, which is WCAG 2.0 Level AA with a couple of exceptions. And then beyond legislation itself, there may be policies at particular organizations, as well as there might be requirements of grants or even sponsorships for specific projects, and they often also require WCAG. So unfortunately, I don't have actually time to go into WCAG today. It's a whole other thing, but I do have some blog posts about it, and if you need your site to be web accessible, WebKit 2.0 or even the new 2.1, which just came out this June, would be the guidelines to meet. They are the ones that are often used internationally, as well as the US just updated their guidelines last year to say the same thing. So it's kind of just what everyone uses these days. So people frequently do ask me, it's like, how to get buy-in from others, because they might be convinced that we should care about accessibility and do something about it, but often accessibility is put aside because it's too difficult, time-consuming, or due to some odd belief that accessible websites are ugly. I don't even know how many times I've heard this, and it's, in my mind, kind of crazy, because some of the accessible websites I've seen are actually some of the nicest. So this is just one example. This is the Wildlife Conservation Society website, and is probably one of the nicest websites I've seen that is also accessible and meets accessibility requirements. So I don't know where this myth comes from, but it's, you know, it's true that some accessible websites are ugly, but much like some websites are ugly, right? Like there's it's not because it's accessible, it's just because there are some websites that are just kind of ugly. And as well, you know, there are numerous reasons you can present as benefits if you ever need to try to talk someone into it. And for putting the practice, the methodologies that are usually recommended as part of accessibility. It might help reflect institutional mission, leadership, and values of, you know, any company talks about being customer oriented. There you go, right? It also actually serves all users, so not just those with disabilities, and I'll talk just a little bit more about this, but actually making a website accessible helps all your users. It also makes sound fiscal policy, so just financially, it tends to improve efficiency, reduce costs, while maintaining quality. It avoids retrofitting, avoids inequitable solutions, avoids litigation, if nothing else. It also, again, frequently fulfills grants and, you know, contract requirements that might be part of something that you're doing. It also obviously adds value to an institution or organization. It will help have better content, benefits more people. It's just easier to maintain and update, and also provides higher capability with various software and hardware. So of course, knowing why doesn't tell you how. So let's just take a quick look. Of course, whether you want to, whether you're told to, I mean, half the battle seems to be just figuring out your approach. And unfortunately, many people see accessibility as something at the end of a checklist, as accessibility often gets pigeonholed as simply making sure that there are no barriers to access for screen readers or other assistive technology without regard to usability. Basically, it's saying that just because your website is accessible doesn't mean it's usable. So you really want it to be both. But I want to also just quickly look at her point on assistive technology. So assistive technology is the term that we often use to refer to any technology that people with disabilities use to help them access the web, or, like, you know, read websites, interact with them, that sort of thing. So, you know, say you were doing research, and actually, let's ask the crowd. So can you think of some assistive technology or technology that you would think would fit under the term assistive technology? Yeah.
Screen reader.
Screen reader, yeah, that's the first one I have. That's probably the most common one that people think of. Any others? See, this is the interesting thing, is that most people stop there, and I'm like, oh no, there is so much more to this list. All right, there is text-to-speech, which is different from a screen reader. Text-to-speech focuses specifically on just reading the text. It doesn't read, like, it doesn't tell you that it's a link, or it doesn't tell you that it's a header or that sort of thing. So screen readers often tell you what kind of text or element it might be, whereas a text-to-speech tends to just read the text. Similarly, there's speech-to-text for the input part of it, as a keyboard alternative. There are screen magnifiers. A lot of people just use the zoom built into a browser, but often people also use screen magnifiers because then it's always on. They don't have to, change it for specific programs or whatever it is. There's also joysticks and other mouse alternatives. So some people there's like a whole slew of things that people will use as an alternative to a mouse, but a joystick is probably the most common.
Why would someone use a joystick instead of a mouse?
Physical disability, most likely, because of like mouse, you tend to have to rotate this way, and then a joystick is held this way, and then you can move it around like this instead of having to do it like this. Also, joysticks tend to have the buttons kind of on the side. Like if you think of like the old school joysticks that you play video games with, right? The buttons tend to be on the side, like on here, so you can move your hand and just kind of hit it. Whereas a click on a mouse, like it's pretty precise movement, and it does require like finger movement. So imagine someone who doesn't really have much movement or dexterity in their fingers, right? You can move the mouse itself or the cursor around moving just the joystick, and then you can click by hitting buttons on the side. So that is it's probably the most common mouse alternative, but there are other things. I'm sure you've heard of like the kind of crazy ones where it tracks your eye movement. For people who are quadriplegic, they like can track your eye movement, and then like you can speak to tell it to click on something. Those are pretty experimental, but again, like that's the way people might interact with the internet, right? Like that is just how it works.
Well, my friend's husband's got Parkinson's disease, so the shakes with the mouse, then the mouse is just shaking, right? So they were getting him something, because he's quite young, unfortunately, and was into the computers. And now it's hard for him he can't control the mouse anymore.
Yeah, a joystick would also usually be
that's what I think
pretty helpful, because a joystick usually you need a bit more force to actually move it. So in a way, it helps with more precise movement, because like, if you can only turn it on or off, right, then that's easier. Whereas a mouse, you have to be so precise sometimes about how you're moving it. Anytime you use a hover menu with a mouse, let me tell you, even I have problems with it sometimes, right? But actually, mobile devices is also a very common one. I have seen a visually impaired person use a phone with the screen completely black, and it's amazing to see. And I've actually seen people use that. But of course, who doesn't regularly use mobile devices, right? And actually the other one, which for some reason is missing on my list today, is keyboards. Many people only use a keyboard and don't use a mouse at all. But who doesn't regularly use a keyboard or a mobile device like touchscreen? So at this point, there it is. There's keyboard. You might actually realize that all technology is assistive technology. You can't think really necessarily about creating content for a specific piece of technology. It's good to keep in mind the different ways users might interact with a website, but that is not necessarily the sole focus. So when creating content, there are just a few simple guidelines that you can follow to make content more accessible. There are just some actually really simple general writing tips. So you can do things like use consistent language, write out acronyms at least the first time you use them, and just be clear and concise. That's really it. Well, okay. I mean, those are not the only things, but all the other guidelines we'll talk about. We'll actually cover more about like the structure or the marking up content. So the first one I want to cover is actually headings. So imagine you're like writing a report. You can think about how you would structure the heading. So you have a title as a heading 1. You have various topics as heading 2. You might have subtopics as heading 3. And you might even break it down further. There is up to heading 6. I've not really seen anyone use it. I don't think I've ever used further than 4, but it is possible. And honestly, that's just the same idea that you would use on a web page. So you think about, like, usually your page title is a heading 1. Or if you have like a blog post, the title of the blog is a heading 1, and then your topics are heading 2, any subtopics are heading 3, and then, you know, subtopics would be 4. You can get up to 6. There you go. The reason why you would do this is that usually there's issues when you rely on just font size or making it bold instead of headers, or if you use the wrong header level. But it's and that is because, as I mentioned earlier, screen readers often actually tell a reader, or like in the screen reader, they'll read out that this is like the top level heading, or they can often also navigate by heading level. So it is really important that you structurally make it clear what level it is. Do you have a question, Mike?
Well, just a comment. One thing that I learned a little while ago, that like, I used to, when you're creating a blog post, I used to like, just use whichever heading I wanted, or use, just make the text bold, just because, I like the look of header 3 better than the look of header 2, so I'll just skip header 2. And I guess for accessibility, that was a big no-no.
Yeah.
Right?
And some themes are really bad about this too. They use the different header styles for a style, and then you just start.
Yeah, so I mean, really what you want to do is just change the CSS file. Like, you just want to change how headers look across your entire site if you don't like header 2, right? And then you can change header 3 to make it look like a header 3 relative to 2. I mean, that is assuming that you have access to editing the CSS, but it's not usually all that hard. So in WordPress, actually, it is very simple. I mean, if you haven't seen it already, you just use the drop down, you select the appropriate heading, or if you're, just doing the HTML code, you would just use the right H number element. Links. Oh man, it's such a common thing. So simple, but so important. So the text for every link should be descriptive and generally unique within a single page. So imagine there was no text around it except maybe the title of the page or some headings. Would you understand what this link is for? If you can't do it yourself, don't expect other people to. So click here is like the example of the big no-no, and I'm like, it doesn't matter. I've seen so many people, they don't necessarily use click here, but like, see more. See more what? like just tell me where that link goes, right? It doesn't have to be the exact title of the site, but just like, why are you linking this, right? Like, is it see more about how to write good links, right? So how to write good links might be the link itself, and it would go to an article. It might have a different title, but that's why you're linking to it. That's what the page is about that you're linking to.
So with that one, sorry to jump in, with just a WordPress site, if somebody had visual or color or perceptive difficulties, would they know it's a link?
That depends on color contrast and how things are styled. So that is slightly different, but I'm talking more about like when you write a link or when you make a link in a blog post, right? So like, cause this link literally just goes to the WordPress site. Like, it just goes to WordPress.com, I think. I actually don't remember if I put WordPress.com or WordPress.org, right? So, but it does just go to the WordPress site. So, and then actually, that's a good point. One of the things that some screen readers will do is they will just, some people just tell it, read me the links. So you can imagine if the whole page, like there's a lot of click here, it's like, well, they don't know what that is, right? They know the title of the page because they know what page they're on, but beyond that, they're just getting the screen readers to read the links. I don't know where click here goes. Yeah.
I was just going to say that this is something too, as time has moved on, because older website design used to be that old way. So in other words, it was a tech literacy versus so they would say, well, you say click here to go to the WordPress site.
Yeah.
because the person doesn't necessarily know that's a link, like a general user,
Right.
like an accessibility user. And
Right.
so now as people are becoming more tech literate, even like interface design, like Apple's been doing this with like iOS, whatever, they've been moving more to this assumption of tech literacy.
And
So
again,
it's
it's not that you can't use those words. It's that if you're going to make a link, it should say where it goes. So you could say, you know, much like you said, click here to go to this site. If you make that whole thing a link, then it will tell you where that link goes. So it's not that you can't use these words, is that just those words does not tell you where it goes. And really the link, even if it ends up being a bit long, should tell you where it goes. I mean, typically the practice now is that even if you use the words click here, usually it's only the latter part that you will actually link, right? But it's kind of confusing if you use the words click here and that part's not a link. So, you know.
Google doesn't like this much either.
One question is, I heard that using open the link in a new tab is bad for accessibility. Is that true in your experience?
It's not that it's bad, it's that it should be in some way, like, really, you should leave that to your user. So for example, in your browser, you can actually tell it to open every single new link or every link that you click on in a new tab or new window. You can actually set that in your browser right now. So imagine that someone set that, but then you forced it specifically to be in a new thing or not, right? Like you can force it to actually open it in the same tab or window. But if someone actually like had that, it kind of depends on the browser and like, I don't know, at this point, it might just force all of them to be one way or the other based on your options. But screen readers typically, it used to be that traditionally in screen readers, what it would do is that it would use the user option unless it specifically said in the code to do one or the other. So if you left that option, like, and usually this was the target attribute. So if you didn't put the target attribute in there, it would just use the user's preferences, right? And so that's often why we say like, oh, this is not good practice anymore to specify it one way or the other. Back in the days of frames, you had to. These days, you're not using frames anymore. So you really should not be using that.
But there's a different point of view on this from the sales point of view. If I have people at my customer's website, yes, they want to see the supplier, and I'm quite happy, go take a look at the supplier, but when you close that, I want you back at my customer's website, because the more times you're there, the greater the chance you're actually going to call him and spend money, which gets me money.
Yeah, I mean, again, it also depends, like there are use cases. Often what happens is what you would do is you would add the little icon that says that it goes to another site. It's like it's the icon that people typically use for external links. If you go on Wikipedia, you'll see it. No, I'm actually quite serious. Go on Wikipedia. If it's another Wikipedia article, it will not have this icon. If it's an outsider, like if it's outside Wikipedia, it will typically have this little icon that shows you. And that icon is usually an image. That image should have alt text to say that it will open in a new window, tab, or just or that often it's just an external site. So you can use something like that. The other thing is that if it's consistent across your entire site, it's also not necessarily bad. So if you have a choice, if there is a specific business decision for it, I would say you can do it, just be consistent across the entire site. So if every single supplier link does that, fine, right? If you can warn your users, even better.
Do screen readers read those little arrows? Yeah.
If it's part of the link, yeah.
Yeah.
So when it comes to images, it's all about what's in the alt text, which I'll also talk about. So let's talk about media. So images, exactly what we were talking about. So you need to include what they call alternative text, or also often just called alt text. which allows you to include a description or descriptive information about the image. While the text is not visible to most users, assistive technologies will read the alt text as a description of the image. So just write it consistently while still providing an accurate description of the image. Now, the important part in your description should be what the image is trying to convey. So a picture of a red panda in one context might describe facial expression, maybe emotion, who knows, for whatever reason, but in a specific context. But that same picture in, say, a biology context might focus on the size and coat color to determine, I don't know, age, gender, health, who knows what, right? So it's all about the context of what you're writing it in and describing what the message that you're trying to convey, rather than just a generic what the image is. Now, if that's all you're trying to convey, maybe that's all you're trying to convey, right? And that's fine. So many online systems such as WordPress will have a field box for you to enter the alt text when you're inserting the image, rather than having to do it afterwards. You can, of course, always do it afterwards by editing the image. Alternatively, though, you can give your image a descriptive caption, which everyone will see as a little bit of text under your image, in which case you can actually leave the alt text blank, because you don't actually want it to repeat. So there is this fancy flowchart which kind of tells you a little bit about this. But the other thing is that if your image has been included for purely just decorative purposes, or is itself an alternate to a textual explanation, then you can actually leave the alt text empty. So you can imagine again that the idea is you're trying to convey a message to your reader, and if someone can't see the image for whatever reason, which also shows if your image for some reason doesn't load, then they get the message. But if it's purely decorative, say it's just like, I've seen people insert what looks like background images as just an image because it breaks up text. Okay, if that's what you want to do, that's fine, that's up to you. And it doesn't really convey a message, it's just decorative. So you can actually still leave the alt text blank because there's no message behind it. It's just to make it look pretty. Anytime you have that, that's fine. And again, if you have, like, say you have products, so an image is an image of the product, but if the product has full description of like dimensions and color and all of that, well, then you don't actually need alt text for your product image because it's all described in text already. This is an alternate form of the text. This is also often for things like tutorials as well, or any how-tos, right? A picture is just showing you what they've described in a text format. So again, you don't actually need alt text for that.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So if a screen reader came across an image that did have no alt text, does the screen reader alert the user that there's no description here, or is it just kind of...
No, it just kind of passes over it. It is better to have it specifically blank than to not have it. So WordPress, for example, if you don't fill it in, and if you actually go look at the code, the alt text is still there. It's just blank, it's empty instead of not being there. And what it does, it actually tells the screen reader specifically that this is purposely left blank. So when it's missing, that's when it's actually a problem. When it's blank, that's okay, because it really depends on the purpose of the image. Yeah.
The problem with the A-type personalities in the group is that your readability score and your SEO score that they calculate for you at the end of your post is reduced if you don't have the alt text filled in.
Yeah.
That's really just to do with being a nerd.
Right. I do understand that. Like, some people have this weird idea that every image needs alt text, and I'm like, no. That might be flagged as a warning, right? Are you sure you wanted this to be blank, rather than an error, so to speak, right? So most of the, I would say, better accessibility evaluators will say, will point it out to say, as a warning, this was empty. Are you sure you wanted this empty? Rather than, no, it's wrong, right? Like, so it is a different way of presenting the information, and like, really, I don't think anyone should be scoring you down for leaving your alt text empty, because again, what if you have a caption? Can you imagine if someone copied and pasted the caption into the alt text for every single image? You would hear it twice. Like, someone using a screen reader would hear that twice. So every image, if you had a caption for all of them, would hear the description twice. And that would annoy me to no ends. I don't know about you, right? Like, it is dependent on kind of the evaluator you're using and that sort of thing. It is unfortunate that there is this myth that goes around that every image should have alt text. It actually kind of drives me nuts because of the very reason that, like, it's not the purpose, right? Like that is not the purpose of alt text. Yeah.
So when you have so WordPress has, like you have your caption, description, alt text.
Okay, so WordPress, okay, so let me just go back. So it does, so we can see it has, like you say, it has title, caption, alt text, and description. So title is the title attribute. Title is actually the one that if you mouse over it, it like shows you a pop-up. It's what we often also call the tooltip. So, in some cases, say like comics often use that as kind of like a extra commentary when people mouse over it. Titles do often get read. It depends on the screen reader's setting. So someone can set it specifically to say read title or don't read title. Okay, so it's kind of an optional description. Title is often used as if you need extra description or a really long description, that like alt text is usually pretty concise. If for some reason you need something longer or more elaborate, then typically that's what title is actually for. But do remember that that is also like the tooltip text. I would treat caption and alt text kind of interchangeably. The difference is how it displays. Alt text doesn't show all your users because it's not actually text showing underneath the image, whereas caption is text that shows underneath the image, right? But generally your alt text is going to be more or less the same of what you would want to put in a caption, right? Because again, alt text is about what message are you trying to convey by adding this picture, and often a caption is similar to that, right? Description in WordPress doesn't actually show except in your media library, and if someone looks at the attachment page. So rather than like, this has changed numerous times in WordPress. It used to be that WordPress, by default, when you insert an image, when someone clicks on that image, rather than just the image, it shows the attachment page is what WordPress calls it. So it's a page with the image, with the title, and with the description. That has kind of phased out. Most people have it by default that when someone clicks on the image, it's just the image in the browser. So almost no one ever sees the description anymore, but it does show in your media library. So if for some reason you want notes to yourself, but mind you, again, it is public, right? Just keep that in mind.
Read the description,
No, because again, it's not actually rendered in the page, so it doesn't actually add, WordPress doesn't add the description to the page. It only adds it to your media library, which again is public because people can go and look at the attachment page, but is mostly used as kind of like an internal description for like in your media library when you're browsing through like extra notes for yourself for the most part. So keep in mind that it's public, but that you can totally use it for like, your own notes, that sort of thing. So description doesn't show up at all. So it is kind of confusing. It is one of those things that I'm like, I really wish that WordPress would somehow just tell you more easily. So the other thing to keep in mind is like the color contrast of an image as well. So especially if you're using colors for figures such as grass, consider very different high contrast colors or a mix of color and pattern. So most of the time I just tell people, it's like, well, imagine you printed it on a black and white document. Can you still read it? And most graphs that are in Excel, for example, by default, if you were to print it in black and white, I would not be able to read the graph. I don't know about you. But the colors it chooses are all solid and they're all dark. So it really is just like that. The other option, though, that I really recommend is that if for some reason you're using graphs and that sort of thing that is based on data, that you include the data as a table underneath it. There you go, right? So even if for some reason the graph is not easy to read, you can read the data that is kind of attached to it. So as to non-text content, other non-text content, including audio and visual material, you should have an alternate text version of some sort, or alternate usually text version. So the suggested method for audio is a text transcript. This is just some random text that I kind of entered, and then you can imagine much like a script is written, you would just kind of write it similarly. For videos, captions are recommended, because even if we don't have audio, you would be able to, hey, look, turn on. Okay. Oh, interesting. Love that. It's turning on in my screen, not turning on in this screen. Oh, and then I don't have the captions option on here because the screen is too small. Great. That's okay. You know what video captions look like. Again, the main thing is that, like, say there is no audio, say and that could be any reason. I mean, someone might not hear the audio because they have an auditory disability. Could be that they have no headphones and they're in an area where they don't want to turn on audio. Who knows? It could be they just don't do well with audio. How-to videos, love captions. I don't like listening to the audio for whatever reason. I prefer just kind of skipping through and getting text. So in general, text transcripts and captions are very useful for non-auditory learners as well. And also if you think about people whose English is not their first language, or whatever language that you're doing this in, if that language is not their first language, it's also usually very helpful. And then using both methods would definitely cover your whole audience. Question?
So on YouTube, is there any way to have them like automatically add like text, or probably wouldn't do a good job?
Yes, YouTube has automatic captions now, but go and edit it. So you can use automatic captions as a way to like kind of get a basis so that you're not typing the whole thing. But much like any other, speech to text kind of technology, it's in no way perfect, and sometimes the captions you get are quite comedic in effect, shall we say. So especially with names, or I don't know, I mean, Google is pretty good with this kind of thing, so I will say for the most part it's not bad, but it doesn't do well with non-English. English is probably the best one it's good at, but also like if someone has an accent, it's just not as good. It's best with like the standard American English. But again, it's great like as if you have nothing written down, no script or anything for this video, and you were just talking or whatever it is great at giving you a basis. And then what it allows you to do is you can then go and edit it. So definitely a good one. There is also descriptive video text. I usually like to show this one. I don't know that it will play properly, and you won't hear the audio unless, oh no, it's HDMI. The audio is supposed to be coming through these speakers, but that is actually what it's reading. I love this because it's like a Star Wars thing, but there you go. That is what you would normally hear in the audio. And so that's just an example. But of course, while descriptive audio is ideal for visually impaired people, watching videos, it's generally very costly to make. Because you can imagine trying to figure out like what to describe, when to fit it in between all the dialogue and sound effects. So it's not usually offered even in movies, unless it's already been produced, right, in some way by some other company. But an alternative sometimes you will find is the description included in a transcript. or as an alternate version of the captions. So often you will see this on DVDs as well, where you just get the subtitles, and then where you get like actually closed captions where it describes like that music is playing or blah blah blah. Like there's like extra description. This goes a bit beyond closed captions, where there's actually description of the action, but that is one way to do it as well. But again, this is typically exempt from, like, having audio description is also because of how much it costs and the resources it takes up, is usually exempt from most requirements when it comes to web accessibility. But it is one of those things that exists and is one of the guidelines in WebKit, for example. So, okay, so just a little bit more on audio and video. So much like images, so text alternate is not needed if already explained in text format. So again, if it's like a how-to and your video is the how-to, but you already written it, like you already wrote it right out, then your video is not going to need captions or whatever it is, right? Much like an image does not need alt text if it's just an image of what you've already described. It should have controls, so any audio and video should have controls. If you use something like the YouTube embed, I mean, those are all built in already, so it's not usually a concern, but it is something that they should have. At the very basic, should just have pause and play at the very least, right? But audio often, I find, you can go to a website and music starts playing and I'm like, oh my god, where's the pause button or stop button? And you're like, there's no stop button. Well, I'm just gonna close this website and never come back again, right? Like, so, but really, it should have controls of any, if there's any kind of audio video. Also avoid flashing. This is I'm sure everyone's heard of epilepsy. The guideline is that you should not have anything flash 3 times in 1 second period. So it's almost seems like a random one that was thrown in, but is very important, obviously. And then finally, nothing on your website should ever autoplay, because everyone knows how annoying it is. Whether it's actually audio, video, or even a set of images. One of the most common things that autoplays on a website is a carousel, or also known as image sliders. Having something automatically change on the site can be very disorienting to users, especially for those who don't actually see it happen. But then it might do, like some screen readers, for example, if some content changes on the site, the screen reader will say, oh, this is actually a new page because it has new content. I'm going to start reading it from the beginning again. So every time that changes, the screen reader will go back to the beginning of the page. So if you can imagine that, well, we could all imagine how frustrating it might be. Now, not all carousels or image sliders do that. Like, they don't necessarily change the content in such a way that a screen reader will do that, but it is a possibility. And not that there aren't accessible carousels or image sliders, but in general, much like a video or much like audio, you should let your user control when it plays. So to summarize, images, alt text, pretty simple. Audio, have a transcript. Video, any of these will do. All of them is great, but any of them will do. At the very basic, a transcript is great. And again, if you are using YouTube, having the transcript in the YouTube transcript area, totally fine.
You know, Cynthia, sorry, we were laughing at the no more flashing 3 times in 1 second. But WordPress at December likes to offer the WordPress snow. You know, on blogs, the snow comes through on your blog.
Yeah.
That and I think WordPress things, on all the WordPress blogs I read, it just is there in December. Drives you just crazy because you just have those little snowflakes coming on your blog.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't fall under that guideline because it's not like an actual flashing, but it is, yes. So it is one of those things where I'm like, okay, WordPress, can you at least let me turn it off somehow, you know? Or like, you know, individual administrators should be able to turn it off. I don't know, but it's, yeah, I don't know that they still do it.
I think this year they finally heard
They stopped, yeah. Okay, Okay, so let's get to actual WordPress sites. So probably the most important is choosing your theme. I highly recommend one of the ones that it's marked, that is by WordPress.com. It's basically by the WordPress team. They're the ones that are famously named after the year they're released. So like 2016, 2017 in words. Otherwise, also check out the themes with the accessibility ready tag. They only receive the tag if they pass the accessibility audit done by the theme audit group. It might not be perfect, but usually, again, it's gone through at least some kind of check and quality control. So that is one thing that you can do is check for that accessibility ready tag. And that applies to both free and paid themes. If you have a theme that's not in the WordPress kind of database where it has all the tags, you can also ask the theme creator whether they've gone through that audit or something similar. So when it comes to plugins, there's a plugin called WP Accessibility, which will make changes to your theme as well and the content to increase its accessibility. The accessibility team also has a ton of links to a few, or well, not a ton, but it has a few other plugins listed on their site that are designed to actually make other common features and plugins more accessible. So there's one specifically, for example, for Gravity Forms, where it's like, so you have Gravity Forms installed, and then you have this other plugin, installed that's like making Gravity Forms more accessible. And then another one that I like to point out is like the minimal Twitter feed. So that's another one, but just take a look at the links. And these are just a few tools that I've heard of or heard good things about. It's by no means an exhaustive list. If you're interested, check out, again, the accessibility team's list of tools since they have others listed. Usually I break it down often like this. Simulation is just things that kind of simulate certain disabilities. There's the colorblind web page filter. You literally stick in a URL. It will give you what the original looks like and what it looks like in whatever you've chosen. Keep in mind that those are just examples. People's colorblind ranges, there's range of everything. And then Fangs is a Firefox plugin, which kind of gives you the text version of what a screen reader would read out. And that's really useful because screen readers are really hard to use. They take so much training. Even trying to use the Apple one is not difficult, or like really difficult for someone who's never really used it or has no one to help them learn. So Fangs is not the only one. There's tons of them, but that's just the one I like to use. There's also obviously evaluation tools. So there's the W3C validator that just validates whether the code is correct according to like just general markup. Like whether the markup is actually just correct, and there are no errors in the actual code, but that's just basic HTML. HTML code sniffer, which I'll talk about just very briefly, as well as WebKeg contrast checker. Those ones I use all the time. HTML code sniffer actually looks at your whole page and like spits out a report to say like, oh, these specific things violate these guidelines, right? Sort of thing. Wave Toolbar is another one that is probably a little easier if you're not super familiar with code and the guidelines. It's a bit more user-friendly in that it puts things in more natural language, and will mark a lot of things that are not errors. So it'll even, and actually I really like it because it has the option of just like showing you the headings, for example, on a page. So you can just like turn on the toolbar and then say, okay, I don't even want styles. I just want plain text, but with the headers marked. So you can just go look at it and go look at, oh, I have a header 3, but this is underneath a header 4. That's wrong. So I really like Wave Toolbar for that. There's both a Chrome and a Firefox plugin, as well as their site lets you just plop in a web address. But I find the plugin easier to use because it's easier to like turn things on and off. Frameworks, if you're a dev, I've never used these frameworks, but I've heard good things about both of them. Axe accessibility is apparently what is the basis for the Chrome browser one. And then Tenon, I've again not used either, but I've heard is really good. Frameworks are mostly for those who do like heavy development work and will use frameworks as unit tests when doing development work. So this is really a quick and dirty way of kind of doing this. But one way that you could assess actual plugins for accessibility is by using an accessibility code evaluator. Again, this is just one example. You can use any tool you want. But HTML Code Sniffer is just a bookmark. You just drag it into your bookmarks toolbar, you turn it on, and it'll spit this out. So now your website might not be error-free. So what I would suggest is you turn it on, see how many errors there are, just write it down, and then you can just close it just like a pop-up. It'll turn off. Turn on the plugin. Might need to add some content to actually, like some test content to make the plugin like work or whatever it is. Especially if it's like media gallery or something other than that. And then just turn it back on and see how many more errors you get. And if you get a lot more errors, that's probably a bad sign. So this is just a very quick and dirty way of doing that. It's obviously evaluating for accessibility takes it can take a lot of work. A typical report where I do I get a client to pick like 5 pages or something that is like 5 typical types of pages. It doesn't take me, takes me at least like 6 hours just to write up a brief report, let alone like a report which actually tells them how to fix it. It just tells them what the problems are with the general recommendation on how to fix it. So, and that's if you know the guidelines and stuff really, really well, right? And so I don't expect anyone to be able to read up on the guidelines and understand them quickly, but this would be a super quick and dirty way to do it. Again, code errors are code errors. It doesn't substitute the actual usability of something. And just like you have a unique way of setting up your browser and everything, everyone with every type of technology, with disability or not, has a unique way of accessing websites. So one of the things I do recommend is that if you've made an effort to create accessible content, but maybe you've missed something, or maybe it's just not a way of someone accessing your site that you thought of, one of the great ways to be transparent and show your effort and in supporting equitable access is to have an accessibility statement. It really doesn't need to be long. It can even be a very simple statement just to say that you've made the effort, who to contact if someone has concerns. You can check out WebKeg again to see how to make a more official compliance claim. You do have to meet all of the criteria within WebKeg to make a full WebKeg compliance claim, but they also have some sample language that you could kind of just take and be like, okay, well, let's just modify this. And again, just a simple statement to say, well, you've tried your best, but if there are errors like that, they can contact you or whatever it is. And honestly, for the most part, that's just what people are looking for. They want a way to access the content on your site. And if you've made an effort, great, right? I suggest if you want something even simpler that you might look at some public organizations, just search libraries, community centers, municipal governments. Governments sometimes get a bit more legalese, but like a university or college, for example, might have a good one, especially in Ontario, because it's legislated. Often they will have like this full thing, but usually at the top, they will have just a briefer statement that you might get ideas from. There is also this accessibility statement generator that I found, but again, it's like the full WebKeg, and I don't know that I would recommend it unless you actually want to go through the whole process of checking that you meet every criteria. So I know that's a lot of information. If you missed anything, obviously it's being recorded. I will also, this is actually live, so it's just on our website. All the links, because I hate the clutter that links take up, especially some of them are quite long. Most of them were actually clickable links, so it's all there. Did I give you the link to this yet? Maybe not. I think I did.
Well, a link.
Oh, I gave you the speaker deck version. I'll give you this link as well, and Mike can post it on the meetup page, and you'll be able to click away at it. All my speaker notes are actually in here, but I've actually put out a blog post on my blog as well with the speaker deck links and the actual notes or transcript in a easier to read format. And then hopefully this is just enough to get you started. I'm happy to answer like any questions as well. And if you only take one takeaway from today, it's just to remember that your efforts in making your content accessible can help a lot of people and not just those with disabilities. I always like this quote, but it seems a bit used. So thank you.
Anybody want to start with any questions that are just burning to ask? I got one.
Yeah.
I wrote a blog post recently where I had a bunch of images, and it was kind of like giving a bunch of instructions. There's a bunch of steps on how to do something. And so in the image, I'd have I just take a screenshot and have a little arrow pointing to something. And then in the caption, I would add sort of telling the reader what to do on this step. So the first one says, there's a picture of the screen, it has an arrow towards this button that says log in. So in the caption I said, log into the page. There's the caption. But in the alt text, I added something to sort of describe the image more. Like I said, this is a picture of the WordPress home screen and there's an arrow going to the top right towards the button that says log in. And I'm not, first off, does that make sense what I'm just
Yeah. I mean, you could make it a little more concise because, again, to get the message across for someone who can't see the image, I don't know that an arrow really, do they care about the arrow? Having a little more, though, is not necessarily bad, right? You want to be, it's a balance between concise and being descriptive, actually, right? It's kind of a bit of a balance to try to keep it not super long, but then also trying to get the message and describe it. What you've described is probably a little more verbose than what I would put, for example, but it's not wrong, it's not bad in any way, and it still will obviously get the message across. So that, again, is the important part. If you're a little more verbose about it, that's fine.
Yeah, it depends on how you deliver it. I read that post and used it, and so I read the whole thing because I'm a nerd. But then I wouldn't want to go back and read the whole thing. It's too cumbersome as I'm doing it. So Mike, in different font, had the dummy's guide. Do this, then do this, then do this. So I could ignore the more verbose parts, but just go back to them when I was stuck on something. So I think it's how you present it. He had all the information, but then he had just a slide you could read of simple point from what to do, once you already read it. So it was good to have the detail there for non-techies who could go, oh yeah, this is what he means. But then in different font, clear and readable, he had, as you were doing it, you didn't have to go back and you clearly saw, so you didn't miss the steps.
Well, he was talking about the alt text versus the caption. Right. Yeah. So, but again, it's as long as you've gotten your message across, it's fine. That is the important part. If you're a little more verbose about it, really, that's fine. And, having that little bit of extra description is not necessarily a bad thing because it often sometimes depends on the context. So, being in a classroom, for example, is one of the ones I like to use. I am with my education background, but one of the things is that in classroom settings, for example, we tend to be more verbose when describing things because sometimes, for example, someone who is visually impaired needs or is using an alternative format of, say, a book needs to be on the same page. So, like for example, I actually used to work in an accessible textbook production organization. The audio, like we would actually write, like add in the text things like what page number and that sort of thing, because if you're listening to the audio, how do you know what page it's on? And often an instructor will say, go to page blah, 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 right? So it kind of depends on the context as well. So being a little more verbose, you don't want to be like writing a novel, but being a little more verbose is not a bad thing. And again, by describing a little bit more of the image itself, if someone says, oh, you just, there's an arrow to point you where it goes, and that person knows what that other person is talking about, even if they can't see the image, right? So it's not necessarily a bad thing. As long as you've gotten the message across, that is the important part. Yeah.
Is it too redundant to put in something like image of, photo of in the alt text, unless maybe it's like a logo or a graph that you want to point to?
Even then, you would say logo.
You could just say logo.
Yeah, like you could say like company logo, and then you could have a short description of what it looks like, right? Because which company it is obvious from what site they're on, unless it is a different company's logo that or whatever it is, right? Like if, for example, you were doing a blog post about like different company logos, then you want to say which company it is. But if it's the company logo for the site that you're on, then having the company name in there is actually redundant. So again, it is a balance between being concise and descriptive, but also again keeping in mind the context, because what you put in that description can change drastically depending on the context of where that image is put in. So there is no generic alt text that I can give you, right? Like that red panda thing, I'm like, again, it's like, am I describing something in a biology class? Am I describing something in an English class? Like, I'm going to give you very different descriptions. Any other questions? Sorry, I'm trying to be like cognizant of the time, and I'm like, this is a lot longer than I had originally planned, but with the questions and everything, they're very good questions, so.
Yeah, no worries about the times. The other presentations haven't come, so no worries. But yeah, any other questions anyone wants to shoot before we jump to help desk? All right. Well, another round of applause.